It's now time for question and answer by our elder pastor, Brother George.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today we have a skeleton crew. It feels like I keep having to explain the culture because I realize when I'm talking that sometimes it doesn't resonate because maybe you had a different, no, this one's not going to resonate. So it feels like when I show up to class, or when I was a kid and you show up to class and it was a snow day and it snowed. Can y'all relate? No? Y'all can't relate to a snow day. It doesn't snow in the Caribbean. So when it snows, you said rain? A rain. See, Americans have a hard time comprehending that as well unless you live in certain parts of the country, how rain could be destructive. I mean, it could flood and mess up your basement and you didn't have insurance. That's extent. It's not going to kill you. But to understand torrential rains and towns being flooded, that doesn't make sense to an American unless you live in another part of the country and there's a hurricane or something and takes your house away. But otherwise, no. So yeah, on a snow day, you show up to school. There's nobody in school. Nobody came. You didn't even need to come. Snow day. Buses can't get anybody there. It's just there's nobody there. But I mean, there's plenty of people here y'all can't see online. But that's what it feels like because a number of people are away today. So we will make the best of it, but it still feels like a snow day. Nevertheless, I figure I'd take the opportunity to begin to chisel down some of the questions that we got. And I picked one due for the morning. And the question is, if Moses and Elijah are dead, how come the disciples saw them talking to Jesus as spirit beings? What was the transfiguration and its significance? And it centers around Matthew 17.
Yes, sir.
And this question actually was duplicated. So a number of people may have had this on their mind. So I'll take a shot at that. So if we turn to Matthew, for one, we find Christ interacting with the disciples. As we go through the narrative, we'll see that it is not all 12, that it is just a number of them that the focus would be on. And furthermore, what we are about to see is encapsulated in a vision, or what's another word? It's not an actual in real time occurrence. It's happening in their minds. It's a vision. I guess everybody knows what a vision is. A little stronger than dream, I would think. Okay. And so the question is, if Moses and Elijah are dead, how are these brothers showing up on this mountain when we read the narrative? But what we're seeing is it's not the actual entity that was the man Moses and that was the man Elijah. It's a vision. And what is the significance of the transfiguration? Why does it seem to have prominence in religious circles? What importance does it serve? And I would say that it addresses the role of the Messiah. It addresses the expectations that people had, particularly the disciples of the Messiah at that point in time. And it was to substantiate who Christ was, validate who he was as not just the Messiah, but the Son of God, and furthermore, a being that was the Messiah, a being that was the Son of God, that actually knew what he was doing, because it would come off as if Christ didn't know what he was doing when you look at the expectations that people had. So with that, we would start in Matthew 16 and verse 21. Here we find that the last year of Christ's ministry, a number of times, he's trying to let the disciples know, remind them that he's going to have some tumultuous experiences, that they are going to have some tumultuous experiences that will culminate in his death and his suffering, and they're not getting it. And this continues to happen when you look at the narratives. The last point, the last year of his ministry, that third year, he's being more pointed about letting them know, look, this is how things are going to play out, and they're not getting it. And we see another occasion of this in Matthew 16, verse 21. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hands of the elders, the chief priests, and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. And so during one of these occasions, verse 22, Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. Never, Lord, he said, this shall never happen to you. So Peter takes him to the side, and he very well may have been expressing feelings that the others had. Like, listen, it doesn't have to play out like that. You ain't got to go through like that. We can make arrangements. It doesn't have to be that way, you know. Keep your chin up, sort of thing. And I'm sure Christ did not find that necessarily comfortable, given the trepidation that he may have felt, knowing what he would have to go through to have a close associate attempt to dissuade him, to have a close associate that didn't understand the importance of what needed to be done, or to have an influential pawn of Satan amongst all the other outlets and exposure that Satan may have towards Christ, to have to deal with that. And so Christ answered in a way that let Peter know that he wasn't in favor of that mentality and that way of thinking and that approach. Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns. So he addresses whatever influence Satan may have been trying to impress behind the scenes, at the same time letting Peter know that that is a very human, short-sighted way of seeing what needed to be addressed. The sins of mankind needing to be removed, mankind needing to be reestablished with God the Father, the Holy Spirit that would need to be made available, Christ needing to be accepted as that sacrifice for whole humanity and to be accepted by the Father. All the things that would play out, these things needed to take place, and one of the ways in which that happens is through his death and suffering. And the disciples weren't getting that. They were expecting a military leader that would show up on the scene in their day and age and invoke a sense of national pride that would spill over into an uprising and going forward political dominance and national dominance as a military and economic and theological source. That was not going to play out in that moment at that time, and the disciples didn't understand that. Christ then goes on to try to explain that one's own interest have to be preceded by God's interest, that one's own sense of how life should play out, our expectations, those things follow after the will of God. And so in Matthew 16 from 24 to 28, or to 27 rather, he touches on that. At the end of the day, I'll return to that paragraph. But dropping down to verse 28, as he's explaining this, he says, "Truly I tell you, some who are standing here will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom," which you would think would further enforce their limited thinking. They're already thinking the kingdom is coming in their day and age. So now they're still thinking the same thing, but that's really not how it was going to play out. If you haven't noticed, all the disciples have died. They're not alive. And so they did pass. And yet, three of them did witness this transfiguration, this vision of Christ as a spirit being, accompanied by two other individuals of note in Bible lore that have been transfigured into spirit beings in their appearance and in their raiment, in their clothes. And so now in chapter 17, verse 1, after 6 days from this occurrence, this incident where Christ had to address this limited way of thinking that the disciples were displaying, particularly shown through Peter's admonishment, like, listen, we could do things another way, showing the disciples they just weren't getting it. They weren't understanding what needed to be done. Another point, prior to that discussion, prior to that incident, prior to that exchange, Christ asked the disciples, "Who do you guys think I am? What role do you think I'm playing?" And they began by answering what the popular consensus was, which was off the mark. And then Peter stated that he was the Messiah, the Son of God, which was more in the right direction. But again, people's expectations of who the Messiah would show himself to be at that moment deferred from what was actually going to happen. And so this vision, and so the reason for this vision, and the reason for a need to kind of substantiate the validity of who Christ was. Because again, his resume is starting to be doubted. It's like he doesn't know what he's doing. So many times we see this in business. A company stops making money. You could be the CEO of Disney. It's like, okay, we need a replacement. This guy doesn't know what he's doing. A couple of movies come out and they flop. And then in fact, that's actually what happened a year or so ago. They replaced the CEO of Disney with the prior CEO. So Christ is getting these rumblings from popular opinion, perhaps his own disciples in their thinking, the following of the women and other supporters that he had, and as we saw not too long ago, John the Baptist. Chapter 17, verse 1. After 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter, James, and John, the brother of James, kind of redundant, right? And led them up a high mountain by themselves. So he took 3 of the disciples. There he was transfigured before them. His face shone like the sun, and his clothes became as white as the light. Just then, there appeared before them Moses and Elijah talking with Jesus. So we get a sense of what happened in Matthew. But to get a fuller sense, you would compare it with the other Gospels. Keep in mind, Matthew's version is kind of a hearsay to an extent. Because the version he's hearing, he's going to hear after Christ's resurrection. He's not going to get it firsthand. He wasn't there. Luke's version is, again, hearsay, because Luke interviewed a number of people years after Christ was resurrected. And he put it together to get a sense of creating a narrative. Mark's version, indirectly, I guess you could say, is hearsay, but it's Peter's account, and Peter was there. Mark was the scribe for Peter. So Peter's telling him everything that he saw, and Mark wrote it down. So we'll go to flip over to Luke's version first. Luke chapter 9, verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. So, one, we see Luke is saying it's about 8 days. When you read Luke's account, it's never exact. It's always, it's around this, around that, because he's just dealing with a number of eyewitnesses like years and years later. Matthew and Mark, they say it's close to 6 days. So again, chapter 9 of Luke, verse 28, about 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John, and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. We weren't told this in Matthew's version, but Christ, stepped away and he took these individuals with him, as we saw occur prior to his arrest. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. So, a number of differences in the other Gospels. One, when you read the other Gospels, you see that Peter, James, and John, they see Christ talking to Moses and Elijah. But the other 2 Gospels don't say what they were talking about. Luke's Gospel attests that Christ is talking to Moses and Elijah about him going to Jerusalem, about his death and his suffering, about what he was going to endure and what was going to occur to him. And these 3 disciples are overhearing this. And we also see that they were sleepy. These guys can't stay awake for nothing. And we saw that this took place prior to his arrest as well. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to him, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." And there's a little insert that says he didn't know what he was saying. I guess, you just wake up, you don't really know what's going on, and you just start babbling, you're not too clear. They're up in this mountain. It's unclear whether they stayed for the night and then came down the next morning, or whether they stayed there throughout the day and then came down later. But at any point, whatever the case, Peter suggested that they build some shelters, similar to the shelters that you would see during the Feast of Tabernacles, when shelters are built for people to stay in. They're like little huts. We kind of did something like that during the feast. We had a construction. That's not how it would look, though. The construction that we had, it was all tall. You could walk in and sit down and dance. No. There's a little model that we had. I don't know if you could get the sense of what that would look like in real time, but it looked like a child's playhouse. You can't stand up straight in that. It's something you kind of lay down and crawl into. So these are the kind of structures that they're talking about, almost like a small tent that we would have when we went camping. But even those tents can be kind of big, but this would be a smaller type structure that they would put together. Verse 34, while he was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and did not tell anyone at that time what they had seen. So God the Father then, in a cloud, it makes himself known. And he expresses that this is my son. He vouches for Christ and admonishes the 3 disciples to listen to him. And this is the verification, the authenticity part that I was referring to. On the heels of all that doubt that the disciples may have had in what Christ was doing or not doing, and saving up money for a political promotion, not even political, military promotion, and building weapons and an army. Well, these things aren't being done. Does this guy know what he's doing? And here we have that support and that understanding that the disciples are to listen to him and have faith in what he's expressing. And listen to him would be the key word, because they weren't. He kept saying that he had to suffer and die, and they weren't getting that. Their faith and trust in that sense was wobbly. Now we'll turn over to Mark's version, Mark chapter 9. And we could start in verse 2 again. After 6 days, Jesus took Peter, James, and John with him and led them up on a high mountain where they were all alone. There he was transfigured before them. His clothes became dazzling white, whiter than anyone in the world could bleach them. Wow. Talk about contemporary translation. I'm reading from the NIV. And there appeared before them Elijah and Moses, who were talking with Jesus. Peter said to Jesus, "Rabbi, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what to say. They were so frightened. Now, this is Peter's view of what was going on. He was shook, and he's just babbling. Then a cloud appeared and covered them, and a voice came from the cloud, "This is my son whom I love, listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, they no longer saw anyone with them except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus gave them orders not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. They kept the matter to themselves, discussing among themselves what rising from the dead meant. They're still not getting it. They still didn't understand, which is the whole reason for this happening, because of that cloudiness that they had initially in thinking that, well, the Christ Messiahship is going to be expressed in a military fashion at that point in time. And we see they still weren't getting it. So now we'll turn back to Matthew 16. Verse 6, Matthew 17 and verse 6. When the disciples heard this, when they heard I'll start in verse 5. While he was still speaking, Peter, when he suggested, "Hey, let me build some shelters," a bright cloud covered them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Listen to him." When the disciples heard this, they fell face down to the ground, terrified. But Jesus came up and touched them. "Get up," he said. "Don't be afraid." When they looked up, they saw no one except Jesus. As they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead." And so now we have all these versions, and we can put everything together. And so we see the disciples witnessed God the Father come and vouch for Christ, vouch who he was, the Messiah, the Son of God, and basically ascertain, yes, he knows what he's doing, which would put the disciples' interpretation of how things would play out in question as opposed to Christ's timeline. We see that they were terrified at what was going on, that it indeed was a vision. When they heard the voice, they fell on their face, and when Christ touched them and told them, "Don't be afraid," they look up, there was nobody there. It was all in their minds. It was a vision. As they're coming down the mountain from that experience, Christ told them, "Don't tell anyone. Keep this to yourself until he was resurrected." The resurrection part they weren't getting because they weren't expecting him to die. What would you account this to? A bad trip? They had some bad trees? Somebody went and mixed the trees with something? For our audience that does not know what trees are, people may have an experience with marijuana. It may be too strong, or some other psychedelic influence, mushrooms. No, that was not the case. It was a vision. Why Moses and Elijah? Why not, Meshach and Abednego? They don't get any love in the Bible, right? They get tossed in the oven, and after that, you don't hear from these guys no more. Throw them some love, right? Let Meshach and Abednego come and put on some white raiment. Okay, Meshach and Abednego, the three guys that were with Daniel that were thrown into the furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar. Why not them? Why not somebody else? Why not Ruth and who's somebody else? Can I have another lady of the Bible? Ruth and Deborah. Okay. Why not Ruth, Deborah, and Esther? And why got to be two dudes? Why can't it be three ladies?
There you go.
So there have been some suggestions as to why was these two individuals. With Moses was often seen as a precursor to Christ. Yes, as an intercessor between mankind or the population of man and God. And you would see that a lot. God would tell individuals, I talked to Moses face to face. Y'all knuckleheads, y'all have a dream. And look how you're acting out. You would see this take place a number of times when God would talk to Israel. Or, in the case of Elijah, same thing. He was seen as a precursor to Christ. And Elijah certainly had duties that he would perform that were accompanied by behaviors that certainly showed he had a role of importance just by the fact of the things that he could do. It drew a distinction in Elijah's attempts to get mankind to recognize God and behave properly. There are also rumblings, there are also whispers, there are also beliefs that the two witnesses that are to come in the future could possibly be Moses and Elijah.
Yes, sir.
When you would go, but they're dead. Well, why would that stop anybody, particularly God, if indeed such a thing were to happen? Keep in mind, there was a point in time when Christ was resurrected that a number of good people, saints, people that lived properly were resurrected and walked around acknowledging that Christ was the Messiah. So we've seen occurrences where people were brought back to life after they died. We saw it happen to Lazarus. Physical life, not spirit beings. We saw Christ raise individuals and for the sake of not wanting a lot of publicity, go, oh, they're asleep. She all right. She just took a nap. She's asleep. We saw Paul do the same thing as we covered before when a fellow was listening to his sermon and he fell off the third floor. These people were raised to physical life. It's not that far-fetched for people that want to speculate in this manner that these two men could be the two witnesses. Who are the two witnesses? The two witnesses are people that would serve in an Elijah-like fashion. They would come prior to the Messiah or prior to Christ's return. John the Baptist fulfilled that role in Christ's earthly ministry, but there's going to be another representation of this Messiah, this Elijah-like role in the future prior to Christ's second coming. And it would be represented by whoever these two witnesses are. The two witnesses would be men, two men, that would come onto the political scene that is being dominated under a structure led by the false church and the false priest and the false representative of that government, who would be a man that is possessed by Satan, pretending to be the returned Christ, which would not be true. It's a falsehood. It's an impersonator. And so these two men speak God's truth in this political climate. And they have the same powers or abilities bestowed to them. They have the same capabilities or the same, I can't think of the word I want. Yes, thank you.
That's true.
That's 2 for 2 now. There's an individual in our audience that always throws out the word that I'm looking for. They have the authority imbued to them that Elijah had to command the weather and control things with nature that would influence crops and so forth. And they're going to speak God's truth that is not really being emanated from the other false prophets of the world. So, some may surmise that these two individuals, Moses and Elijah, would be the ones that God would have return and continue what they were doing in their physical existence, to have them do it to now a stubborn-headed generation that they would encounter in this period of time. So, ending with what's the significance of this transfiguration? Again, to drive home who Christ was, given the climate or the occurrence among the disciples not being able to recognize how the Messiah's role would actually play out. So back in Matthew, after Christ tells them as they're coming down the mountain, verse 9 of chapter 17, as they were coming down the mountain, Jesus instructed them, "Don't tell anyone what you have seen until the Son of Man has been raised from the dead. Keep this to yourself." Verse 10, as they're walking down the mountain, the disciples, those three, Peter, John, and James, have more questions after what they just saw. The disciples asked him, "Why then do the teachers of the law say that Elijah must come first?" So they see what just happened. Maybe it's starting to sink in, maybe it isn't, that this is something that's going to happen in the future. If it is, now they're going, well, I thought Elijah was supposed to come first. What's going on? Jesus replied, "To be sure, Elijah comes and will restore all things. But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they did not recognize him, the people at large, but have done to him everything they wished. In the same way, the Son of Man is going to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he was talking to them about John the Baptist. What probably didn't set in was that, well, John the Baptist was killed. He's going to be killed too, and it's probably still didn't sink in. They walk down the mountain after this discussion. And when they get to the bottom of the mountain, Christ and the three are now approached by a man that's looking to have their son healed. They walked right back into something going on. There's a commotion once they get to the base of the mountain. When they came to the crowd, a man approached Jesus and knelt before him. "Lord, have mercy on my son," he said. "He has seizures and is suffering greatly. He often falls into the fire or into the water. I brought him to your disciples, but they could not heal him." So now, the remaining 8 disciples that were left behind, this man brought his son to them to try to have, and when you read the other Gospels of Luke and Mark, and you put it all together the way we just did with this scenario, we find that this boy was demon possessed. This demon was particular in the fact that the demon cannot speak and the demon can't hear, is deaf and mute. In addition, it seems that this demon seemed to torment the boy when the boy is around water or fire. Seems to be fine any other time. He seems to go into seizures. In actuality, it's not a seizure. He has he got some paranormal issues. And every time he's around fire or water, this demon is trying to kill the kid. Throw him into the water when it's enough to drown him, or throw him into the fire. So the family has to really watch out for where this kid is at all times. So Christ's response, "You unbelieving and perverse generation." He is not talking about the public. He's talking about those 8 guys that they left behind at the base of the mountain. He's just through with them. "How long shall I stay with you? How long shall I put up with you? Bring the boy here to me." You can see the same thing in the other examples. I'll try to do that real quick. Luke 9. Here in verse 37 in Luke 9, Luke's version, it's the next day, as if they stayed up the whole night. The next day, when they came down the mountain, a large crowd met him. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him, and he suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions, so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." And Christ responds, "You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Again, his disgust is with the disciples. As we go through this and you compare the other Gospels, when the boy is brought to him and the demon sees Christ, then the demon is like, "Oh man, we got problems," and throws the child to the ground. And the boy begins to go through seizures again. And Christ tells the demon to leave and not come back. So, I'll turn back to Matthew for a second to get what happens next. Then in Matthew 17, verse 19, then the disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" It's like they're trying to because mind you, this is part of what fed Christ aggravation and just annoyance with them. He had given them authority, that word again, he had already given them authority to cast out demons. And they went out 2 by 2. And they did this before, but now they had a problem and they couldn't do it. The disciples came to Jesus in private and asked, "Why couldn't we drive it out?" He replied, "Because you have so little faith. Truly I tell you, if you have faith as small as a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move. Nothing will be impossible to you." As time went on, that mustard seed for them did grow, and they were able to do more. When you compare the other Gospels, you see that it was more than just having faith. It was the fact that they needed to be close to God. Christ told them, this type of demon, you really got to be on point. You got to be close to God. It requires pre-position. You already have to be close to God. And to do that, you would have had to have undergone a great deal of prayer and fasting to be in that kind of condition. But nonetheless, their faith was not what it should have been. And so some months had gone by already, a number of months, from when they went out 2 by 2 like that. That was at the beginning of Christ's ministry. We're now in his 3rd year. And maybe they're out of practice. Their faith wasn't right. In addition, this particular demon appears to be a stronger degree of demon. I guess it can't hear you and doesn't have to recognize. It has to recognize God's authority. But they had been given that authority, but again, their faith was wobbly, and they were unsure. And so the demon did not respond. And when Christ came down the mountain, saw what occurred, he understood the mechanics, the logistics of things, and recognized what the problem was, and was annoyed. And he's thinking that they would have come along more by this point in time. Next thing you see, I'm in Luke chapter 9, verse 43. While everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did, he said to his disciples, "Listen carefully to what I am about to tell you. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men." When you compare the other Gospels, right after this, he tries again, and he tells them, "Look, there's some things that are going to happen. I'm trying to let you guys know to brace yourselves so you're not caught off guard," and they're not getting it. Verse 45, but they did not understand what this meant. It was hidden from them, so they did not grasp it, and they were afraid to ask him about it. So he says something again. They're not clear, but they're afraid to ask him about it because he just got mad at them because they didn't have enough faith to do what he felt they should have been able to do after the authority it had already given them. And so we see their faith, their understanding of their role in the greater scheme of things, their understanding of the Messiah's role in the scheme of things was what was at fault. And when you look at the full context, you see what the Transfiguration was about, why that was happening, what that was attempting to drive home for the disciples, if not then in that moment, then afterwards, after Christ was resurrected, to solidify their faith and understanding of Christ's role as the Messiah and the coming King. Does that answer the question?
It does.
All right.